We will spend the next few minutes discussing various concepts related to ecosystems and global ecology. We'll focus on nutrient cycles, the concept of trophic levels, as well as some environmental issues that are highly relevant to us today. Let's begin with briefly discussing just a few biogeochemical cycles. We won't dwell on a lot of details, but let's just first briefly review the carbon cycle. Here we have illustrated the carbon cycle, lots of carbon in the surrounding atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide can be taken up by organisms that are undergoing photosynthesis, such as plants living on land, algae living in water, and so forth. And a lot of that carbon is returned back to the atmosphere, again in the form of CO2, as a result of organisms undergoing cell respiration. But also, of course, anytime we burn fossil fuels, coal, gas, and so forth, that too results in the release of lots of carbon back into the atmosphere. So the carbon cycle, briefly illustrated here. Let's also briefly review the nitrogen cycle. Again, lots and lots of nitrogen in the form of gas, so gaseous nitrogen out in the surrounding atmosphere. It turns out we and other organisms can't use that nitrogen directly in that form. It has to be converted to some other form before we can incorporate it and use it within our bodies. So it turns out that essentially bacteria are the only organisms capable of fixing nitrogen, and that is converting it to a form that can be used by other organisms. So we have bacteria in the form of cyanobacteria out in lakes, streams, and oceans that are fixing the nitrogen, removing it from the atmosphere. And we also, anytime we produce fertilizers to be used on fields, that too is a way to remove nitrogen from the atmosphere. And the only way that essentially we can add nitrogen back to the atmosphere, again, is bacteria. So bacteria play this crucial role in both fixing nitrogen and also releasing nitrogen in the gaseous form back to the atmosphere. Not all elements, of course, cycle through ecosystems in the gaseous state. For example, phosphorus. This is just one example of where an element that is valuable and needed by organisms, think about the structure of DNA molecules, for example, that comes from deposits of phosphorus in rocks and minerals and so forth that ultimately can be used by living organisms. But you think about some of these elements we just mentioned, nitrogen, phosphorus, for example, these are often components in fertilizers. And these fertilizers, of course, are highly valuable for growing crops and plants and so forth, but they can also cause problems if too many of these elements find their way into various ecosystems. As an example, many detergents used to contain phosphates, very effective as a cleaning agent, but it turns out that these phosphates were making their way out into the aquatic ecosystems, lakes, for example. And when they did so, that caused lake eutrophication. And that's what we see illustrated toward the right here. So what was happening is that phosphates were serving as a limiting nutrient to algal growth. And when those phosphates made their way into lakes and ponds, that caused explosions of algal populations. So that really disrupted the ecosystems of various lakes throughout the country. Even on a more broad scale, if you think about a lot of the fertilizers that are used in fields, a lot of the excess fertilizers make their way into streams, into rivers, and a lot of these rivers, for example, empty into the Mississippi River, which eventually dumps into the Gulf of Mexico. So what we're seeing here is an aerial view of part of the Gulf of Mexico where rivers have taken a lot of the runoff from fields at different parts of the country, and they've dumped the excess nitrogen and phosphorus and other components of fertilizers into the ocean, causing these algal blooms, which can cause big problems. Often we have these dead zones forming. What happens is the algae can grow like crazy, but then when they are broken down by bacteria, that results in the loss of oxygen in the water in that area. So as a result, fish and other larger aquatic organisms simply are unable to survive in those areas. And of course, that's a big problem. Also, if you think about all the different organisms interacting with each other out in nature. You've heard of food chains or food webs before, but also let's think about all these interactions in terms of trophic levels. So trophic levels, we're referring to essentially feeding levels out in ecosystems. So for example, if we focus on the far right column here, most ecosystems rely on plants of some sort undergoing photosynthesis to produce their own food that ultimately serves as a source of food for all other species in that particular ecosystem. So we might call plants the primary producers, and then anything that feeds directly on the plants, we would call those primary consumers. And then other organisms that feed on the animals, that feed on plants, we'd call those secondary consumers. But notice that ultimately these trophic levels terminate in some top-level predator. So it might be a hawk, it might be a larger mammal. It just, of course, depends on the ecosystem in question. If you think about it, ecosystems are only capable of sustaining a certain number of trophic levels. And why is that? Well, if you were to go out into an ecosystem and take a look at and measure all of the available energy or available biomass at any given trophic level, it turns out you see some very distinct relationships. So the question is, how much energy is available to higher trophic levels? Here we see this concept of an ecological pyramid. So primary producers, the plants, yes, they might have an awful lot of energy available, but then the primary consumers that eat the plants, they come along, eat the plants, and they use some of those nutrients, of course, for cell respiration, growth, and development, but only a portion of the energy in the primary producers is now in the form of biomass in the primary consumers. And so if you look at these successively higher trophic levels, what you notice is only 10 to 20% of the available energy in any given trophic level is available to the next higher trophic level. So again, as a result, that's why ecosystems can only sustain a certain number of trophic levels. We can also briefly introduce this concept of a trophic cascade. And the idea is anytime you disrupt a population at any given trophic level, that's likely to have impacts, cascading impacts on other trophic levels as well. So just to illustrate this basic concept, wolves were recently reintroduced into Yellowstone National Park. So what impact would the reintroduction of wolves have on other species that live in that area? Well, if you can imagine, now there are more wolves present. As a result, more elk are being consumed by the wolves. So an increase in wolf population results in a decrease in the elk population. If there are fewer elk around, therefore there are fewer plants being eaten, so the plant populations would likely increase. Okay, again, if you're just looking at the impact of wolves on elks and then ultimately on plants. So again, this idea of trophic cascade, when you disrupt in any way a trophic level within an ecosystem, that's going to have cascading effects on other trophic levels as well. So let's briefly talk about some of the impacts that humans have had on our environment. And let's begin with a variety of toxins that we find out in the environment. Just a few examples. DDT, this used to be used quite readily across the United States as an insecticide, very effective at killing mosquitoes. Still used in certain parts of the world. Mercury, we find this in the environment as well. Selenium, another example. But what we have here are just a few examples of toxins that not only take a long time to break down, if at all, but they also are absorbed in the bodies of organisms. So what are the implications of that? Well, there's this concept called biological magnification, or simply biomagnification. So let's think about DDT as an example. We no longer, at least here in the United States, spray DDT. And why is that? Well, it turns out that back in the 60s and 70s, it was discovered that DDT was causing problems with birds, specifically raptors, eagles, falcons, hawks, and so forth. What was going on? Well, it turns out that there were populations of the bald eagle, for example, were declining rapidly. And it was ultimately traced to problems with DDT. So, for example, if you go out and spray DDT, it might be, again, it doesn't break down very quickly, so it might be present in lakes and streams at fairly low levels. so low that perhaps that's not a problem. That doesn't have any impact on the organisms that live in the water per se. But as the organisms consume other organisms, so plankton might have very low levels of DDT. Small fish that eat the plankton, they'll have slightly higher levels. Larger fish that eat the smaller fish, they'll have slightly higher concentration of DDT in their tissues. So ultimately, by the time you look at the top level predator, for example, a bald eagle, for example, the DDT is found in concentrations in its body. It doesn't kill the eagle per se, but what it does is disrupt with the production of eggshells. So when the eagles were laying their eggs, the eggshells were just too thin, they were breaking, and as a result, we saw populations of these birds plummet. Again, as a result of biomagnification of DDT in the tissues as we looked at progressively higher trophic levels. So let's now briefly talk about the greenhouse effect. You see the greenhouse effect illustrated here, caused by a variety of greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide, that's a biggie. Methane, natural gas, that's an important one as well. Nitrous oxide. So in essence, what these greenhouse gases do, they allow sunlight to pass right through them. When sunlight hits Earth, a lot of that light is reflected, and it can go right through the greenhouse gases, of course. But a lot of that light is converted to heat. And it turns out, yes, some of the heat can radiate, but a lot of the heat, of course, is trapped as a result of these greenhouse gases. And so this picture illustrates the basic greenhouse effect. So just a few comments about some of these greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide, for example. This has been increasing quite a bit over the years, largely as a result of burning fossil fuels, but there are other sources of CO2 in the atmosphere as well. If you look at other greenhouse gases, first of all, in the top left, we see CO2 levels increasing over the years. But other greenhouse gases, methane, we see in the upper right, nitrous oxide, CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, they have different problems as well. But the point is, a lot of these greenhouse gases have been increasing over the years. So other lines of evidence that indicate potential problems with climate change. So greenhouse gases have been increasing. The amount of snow on mountaintops, that has been dramatically declining over the years. Glaciers have been melting as well. Some glaciers have actually been growing, but for the most part, most glaciers on a global scale have been retreating and melting over the years. They predict roughly a 2 to 11 degree increase in temperature over the next 100 years. This could have dramatic impacts. And in fact, we already see lots of implications of climate change already. So just a few implications of global climate change. Well, we're going to see rising sea levels. This is going to occur as a result of not only glaciers and the polar ice caps melting, but also as the water warms up, as oceans warm up, they actually expand just a bit. So again, rising sea levels, obviously a problem for many parts of the world. Life cycle changes. Plants are blooming at different times of the year than they used to. Insects are migrating at different times of the year, and so forth. More extreme weather conditions, more intense storms, more extreme drought. These, of course, are, again, implications of climate change. Ocean acidification. If you have more CO2 out in the air, that's more carbonic acid forming in the oceans when CO2 mixes with the water. That's going to cause problems with various organisms. For example, corals, you see illustrated in the upper right here. Coral bleaching is a big problem in many parts of the world. So what about ozone? We've talked the past few minutes about global climate change and focusing on greenhouse gases. But what about ozone? Ozone, it too is a bit of a greenhouse gas, but it has other implications as well. So ozone, this refers to O3. This is a layer of gas that forms a protective layer in the atmosphere. Essentially, ozone helps to protect organisms from a lot of the ultraviolet light given off by sunshine. So years ago, there was an ozone hole basically a thinning of the ozone layer discovered back in the mid-80s, initially over Antarctica. And what was ultimately determined to be the cause of this was the CFCs, or chlorofluorocarbons, that we used to use for all sorts of things. They're typically propellants. So, for example, hairspray, deodorant, air conditioners, refrigerators, Freon, for example. So these are all examples of these chlorofluorocarbons. And essentially what they were doing is getting up into the atmosphere and destroying the ozone. We have since, of course, recognized the problem, and now we, of course, for the most part, use different types of propellants in all of these sorts of products. And so fortunately, the ozone hole has been healing itself and will continue to do so in the foreseeable future. So that, of course, is very brief. There are lots of concepts that relate to environmental issues that are really in the news all the time and have a big impact on our lives, of course, as well as the lives of future generations. So that concludes our brief discussion of ecosystems and global ecology.